Hi everyone. So yes, my name's Helen Shaw, and I'm also at Maynooth University with John Devney, and I'm also working on the Ancient Woodlands Ireland Project. But I'm bringing up the rear because we're going deeper back in time now. So I'm a palaeoecologist, and I'm interested in the perspective of extending our time period even further. So we've heard that from the start about the 1830s mapping and then the 1609 Downs map, and Annalee taking it back down a bit further to sort of 1500. But really, if we want a time perspective, we have to have something that moves beyond that, because we have this big question mark once we get beyond about 400 or 500 years down a timeline. And if we think about it, and for those who were there this morning, I was saying that if we think about the life of a tree, so we have a big oak tree there representing the life of 400 years, we're not getting many generations, even with the earliest mapping. And so is there something that we can use to help us to go back even further? And I think that most people in this room who are keen on woodlands will know that there is palaeoecology. And palaeoecology is looking for proxy evidence and reconstructing from that ancient woodland, usually by things like pollen. So paleo just means older, for those who don't know or haven't heard of palaeoecology before. You might have heard of paleontology, you might have heard of Paleolithic for the old Stone Age, but palaeoecologists look back in time and try and work out what the environment was doing, and we can do that quite successfully for woodlands. And the way that we do this is through a process of going out and getting cores from the landscape, and then we take subsamples from the cores and we process them through some acid processing techniques, which gets rid of all the rest of the muck around the pollen grains and leaves us with pollen grains on a slide, which we can then count under the microscope. And those pollen grains can be identified to the various different species of woodland tree and often understory plant as well. And through that, we can start to reconstruct which species were there in the past and a little bit of abundance as well. So through some modern techniques, we can look at abundance. So how many trees were in the environment. So that becomes very useful to us. And then we come up with these impossibly complex diagrams. This is one I did in Glenafric years ago. You don't need to read any of it, just to know that you have a time depth bar down the side, and each one of the little graphs along it is a different species of plant identified by its pollen. And then we can see how much the abundance of each type is through that. And then we get an idea of what was round the basin where we got the sample from by what pollen flew into it. So this isn't a new technique, and many of you will know of pollen diagrams from Ireland. In fact, I talked to a few people this morning about pollen diagrams that they'd experienced and found out about in the past. And this is the Irish pollen database put together by Fraser Mitchell and Bettina Stefanini and Rob Marchant. And it shows all of the sites of palaeoecology in Ireland. So there's been quite a lot of palaeoecology in Ireland. And if you think about the things we know about, we say, oh, Ireland was a temperate rainforest, and then we chop down the trees. Part of the reason we know this is through palaeoecological analysis, because we're going back beyond that mapping over the last 10,000 years of history. So all of those sites, just over 500 sites, are very important on the island of Ireland. But why do I have this arrow here for local, and why do some of the sites have different symbology? Well, in actual fact, there's something we know from palaeoecology that's quite important for us in our understanding of woodland in space. And that is that all the pollen flies around in the atmosphere, so the little dots are pollen grains, and it drops into the basins in amongst everywhere else, up our noses, everywhere. The stuff that drops into really big basins in open environments tends to give a regional signal. So it's coming from the tree, the oak trees to this side and the pine trees to the other side. It's all mixing in that basin. But if you go to a small basin under the canopy, you tend to get the trees from that local area. And so if we want to sift out and understand local ancient woodlands and where they were in space, we need to find sites under the canopy. And we can put those together in a variety of pollen diagrams in a landscape to try to build up a picture of what woodland was doing over space and time if we have enough sites. Now, if we take the distribution of those pollen diagrams that came out from the Irish pollen database, and we sift them for really specifically for local scale pollen diagrams under woodland, we come up with maybe 41 sites that have some potential, and then actually about 18 sites are really useful, which I must admit that when I did this work as part of the LEAF project that John was talking about, I was quite surprised at how few, if we started to sift and be really specific about the types of diagram we would use, the local pollen representation in those diagrams, we have quite a small number of sites that can really pinpoint ancient woodland. And we have all of these ancient woodlands already from the Perrin and Daly maps, plus we have a lot of very small fragments of ancient woodland that we've been discovering through LEAF and that we'll discover in wider Ireland through the mapping that Jesko was just talking about and the mapping of Annalee as well in the past. So if we want to understand these woodlands better, my argument would be that the mapping takes us so far, but if we use palaeoecology as well, we can get at more detail and perhaps detail about the species beyond the kind of broadleaf conifer divide that we see in the map symbology. And an example of this from one of those diagrams that does exist, and there's quite a few in the sort of Kerry-Killarney region, and this is a diagram by Fraser Mitchell done in the 1990s, and it's the history and vegetation dynamics of a yew wood. And what's really interesting, I use a pointer here, is that if you can see the pointer, no, you can't see the pointer, it's off. This is yew, Taxus, and we can see that for a long time there was no yew pollen, and then yew pollen started to appear in the diagram and increase a lot. And things like pine and alder decreased. So we have a real switchover of woodland at a particular point in time. And so we can start to see that we might have ancient woodland that's been quite continuous through time, but actually the composition of that woodland can have quite a lot of turnover. And so if we're going to start to think about restoring, putting back, I think it's really important that we have this information about composition, because we're going to be in a position where we have climate changing. We can go back to previous different changes in climate and have a look at those. And we're going to be in a position where land use is changing, the impacts of people are changing on these environments as well. And if we go back into the past, we can see various different management conditions as well. So we can really start to see that we can piece things together in a way that just gives us a greater understanding of these woodlands and their temporal processes. That doesn't mean to say that we've necessarily got to put back what was in the past or change the taxus back to an alder and pine woodland or anything like that. It's just an acknowledgement that we have this process change through time and we can understand woodland through this. So I've given you one example from Ireland, and there are those other really important examples, and overall 500 or so pollen diagrams or palaeoecological diagrams. And they have various merits and they also have various problems. So many of the diagrams that we have from Ireland are not particularly well dated. We use radiocarbon for a chronology for our dates so that we can understand how deep we've gone back in time. We can improve all of those things with modern palaeoecology. But one thing I just wanted to do was just to show some examples of my own previous research, just a couple of examples which might illustrate the point. So back in 2001 to 2004, I did a PhD in Scotland, in Glenafric. And you can see native pine wood along Glenafric, Glenside here. And it was talked about by Stephen and Carlisle, the famous writers of native pine wood book, that to stand in them was to see the past, and that this pine wood was receding and in poor condition. And I was sent there to do some palaeoecological analysis to see what the history of this pine wood was. Now, again, I'm not going to try and give too much detail on this. I have very little mouse control, strangely. Right, so this dark shadowed bit here, thank you, is the pine pollen, and down here is a time scale for a site here, which is where that photo was taken from, where the pine wood was supposed to be receding. 2,500 years ago, there was very little pine pollen. And there was very little pine pollen until we get to about 150 years ago, and then suddenly quite a lot of growth of pine in that region. And this dark grey is the amount of heath pollen. So mainly this area here in the past was heathland, and then more recently it started to grow as a pine woodland. So I think that shows us that sometimes what we think we see in the landscape, we need to go back in time to fully understand. And I'm not by any means saying that this woodland doesn't have a right to be protected, or that we can't restore or spread the woodland further. But we have to be aware that we're at a bit of an ecotone here, and the landscape gets a lot wetter, and it probably just doesn't grow very well most of the time. And I did some work with another little organism that you get in the peat called testate amoeba, and found that there was a drying out of the landscape about 150 years ago. And that may be a reason why we suddenly got this influx of pine, because of that drying out. There are always more questions than answers. So, this is just a small snippet. But if we look further down here, we've got much more pine through time. Okay, so another little, I got 2 minutes. Another little project I did was looking in Skelgill Wood in Cumbria, and that was a woodland that was very much planted over. But there was some small-leaved lime, and small-leaved lime doesn't really grow as far as Cumbria and reproduce in the current environment. It really had its zenith in the mid-Holocene. So the question that the Nature Reserve people wanted me to answer was whether that small-leaved lime had continuity in time. And luckily, there is a way of discovering whether it's small-leaf lime or large-leaf lime in the pollen diagram, and that's by counting on the pollen grain how many reticulations grow across here. So these tiny little holes, they're bigger in one than the other. So you can spend quite a lot of time going down the pollen rabbit hole there. But the main issue was that I found that there was almost continuous lime pollen in those diagrams back to about 1800. So even in a planted woodland, there were elements of that planted woodland that had a long genetic history in that woodland. Someone was asking about genetic histories this morning, so there's a little example of that. So pollen was just telling us that that small-leaf lime had a long history. Okay, so we can have various uses of palaeoecology. We can ask what species were present in the past. What was the continuity or change in the past? Was it normal to have change? Was it normal to have continuity? We can ask all of those questions. And we have these amazing things that fall into bogs, pollen, but also fungal spores. We have insect remains. We have all sorts of things falling into the bogs, which we can use to build that history and talk about environmental change as well. So, we can fill all of those gaps, but there are problems. We can talk about composition of woodland, processes of change, environmental drivers. We can do that through this process, and these are the processes that I'm going to go through in the Ancient Woodlands Ireland Project. But actually, the main problem I have is that bit that wasn't on that slide just now. I started off on process 4.2. 4.1 is finding the sites. And the reason there's little work done is because it's actually quite difficult to find these small hollows under the woodland canopy that have a temporal dimension that laid down over time that I can then go and core and take the samples out of to give me the pollen analysis. So that's one thing. I'm here with a plea for everyone in this room who owns a woodland, knows a woodland, manages a woodland, goes walking in a woodland. Please let me know if you have places that you'd like us to come as part of this project that you think might be ancient, that has wet, boggy hollows in it that might be useful for palaeoecology, because then we can really pull this project together with the help of everyone to find these kinds of sites. And I hope that in 4 years' time, this is me in Glen Affric presenting a pollen diagram, a bit like John was presenting the maps this morning in the woods. And I hope that in 3 or 4 years' time, we can be here presenting pollen diagrams from woodlands near you. Thank you.